We want to turn now to a fateful day you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next month, because November 22nd marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, a day that many believe changed America forever. The first word of it for many of us came from Walter Cronkite.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The nation was plunged into shock. Nothing like this had ever happened. Was it the beginning of World War III? We were terrified. Then came the news that an angry ex-Marine who had once defected to the Soviet Union had been arrested.
Lee H. Oswald, the 24-year-old man whom Dallas police say is a prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy, was questioned for 6 hours at the Dallas police station this evening.
Here is Oswald at the police station. He is saying there, "I did not do it. I did not do it."
Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president and brought Kennedy's body and his widow back to Washington on Air Force One.
I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
2 days later, a grieving nation was shocked once more as an unbelievable scene unfolded in the basement of the Dallas police station. On live television, the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was gunned down and killed.
Oswald has been shot
by a Dallas strip joint operator named Jack Ruby.
Here comes Oswald.
The nation was reeling, desperate for answers. Had Oswald acted alone, or had he been part of a conspiracy? Was a foreign government behind the murder? Could it have been prevented? The new president appointed a high-level commission headed by the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, to investigate.
As of this moment, the report of the President's Commission is public record.
10 months later, the Warren Commission presented its final report and concluded that Oswald had killed the president, acted alone, and there was no conspiracy.
The Commission has found no evidence that either Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby was part of any conspiracy.
Over the years, there have been thousands of theories and allegations of various conspiracies, but as yet there has been no conclusive evidence to contradict the Commission findings. Yet questions remain. In his new book, A Cruel and Shocking Act, The Secret History of the Kennedy Assassination, former New York Times investigative reporter Philip Shenon connects the dots that show the FBI and CIA not only withheld information from the Warren Commission, but prior to the assassination did not tell FBI agents and other law enforcement authorities in Dallas all that they knew about Oswald. Had they done so, Shenon believes the assassination might well have been prevented. Phil Shenon spent 5 years investigating the Warren Commission and the Kennedy assassination. We have plenty to talk to him about. He's with us this morning. We'll talk to him in 1 minute. And we're back now with Phil Shenon. Phil, why do you think the assassination could have been prevented?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of material, much of it that's only been released in recent years, that shows that both the FBI and the CIA were very aware of the threat that Lee Harvey Oswald posed. And, you know, I'm not the only one who believes that. Former FBI Director Clarence Kelly, when he was at the FBI in the 1970s, he was as perplexed by the Kennedy assassination as anybody else. He went into the raw files and found that there was plenty of evidence that had somebody just connected the dots in those few days before President Kennedy arrived in Dallas, the assassination was preventable, perhaps easily preventable.
One of the some of those dots have to do with Oswald going to Mexico City, and that part is well known, but what he did there is not so well known. And as you have gone back, you have found out how much the CIA especially knew about what he was doing down there. One of the things you uncovered was a memo from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover written to the Warren Commission back in June of 1964 that somehow never ever got to the commission. Right. Tell us about that memo, where you found it, and how you came to know about it.
It's sitting in the National Archives. It was classified for years and years and years after the assassination, but it turns out that in June 1964, right in the middle of the Warren Commission investigation, J. Edgar Hoover writes a letter to the Warren Commission saying the FBI has learned from a reliable source that Oswald marched into a communist embassy in Mexico City, almost certainly the Cuban embassy, and announced he was going to kill President Kennedy. And this document for the Warren Commission then disappears. So the Warren Commission never knows that Oswald was apparently talking openly, weeks before the assassination, about killing the president. If the commission had seen this document, it would have raised a million questions that should have been addressed in Mexico.
And had the FBI known about it, the people in Dallas at that time had known what the CIA knew about this, they certainly would have alerted the people on the ground.
Well, that's the thing, that there was knowledge, especially about this mysterious trip that Oswald takes to Mexico City, that was sitting in the FBI files in Washington and at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And again, if somebody had just shared any of that with the FBI office in Dallas, those people would have gone and questioned Oswald, and the world would probably be a very different place.
One of the reasons there's been so many thoughts about was there or not a conspiracy is the fact that after they conducted the autopsy, well, tell us what happened to the notes that the doctor who conducted the autopsy. What became of them?
I mean, there are so many jaw-dropping events just in the first few hours after the assassination in terms of the destruction of evidence. It is just a big theme of my book is how much vital evidence disappears about the assassination and about Lee Harvey Oswald. The night after the assassination, the pathologist who carried out the autopsy of President Kennedy is actually in his home in Bethesda, Maryland, pushing into his fireplace the original autopsy report and all of his notes from the morgue. Several hours later in Dallas, you have a handwritten note from Oswald that he had left there, torn up and flushed down a toilet. Hours after that, you have Marina Oswald putting a match to a photograph that shows her husband holding the assassination rifle. So this is just the first weekend, and the story thereafter is destruction, destruction, destruction of evidence.
And as you recount in your book, the reason the doctor decided to destroy the original report, it had blood on it, and he decided to recopy it.
That's what he said. He said that he noticed that his notes and the original autopsy report had the president's blood on them. He was concerned that this would become some sort of grisly souvenir, and so he pushes them into his fireplace. Now, of course, we don't really know. Maybe there was some error he was trying to hide, or there was something else that he'd been ordered to leave out of the final autopsy report.
One of the most interesting parts of the book is how Lyndon Johnson convinced Earl Warren to be the chairman of this committee. Warren wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
You've got to feel bad for Chief Justice Warren. He did not want to run this investigation, and he initially turned it down flat. He said, "I won't do it. It's a terrible conflict of interest." Then, of course, a few minutes later, the phone rings at his chambers at the Supreme Court, and he's ordered to go to the Oval Office immediately. And he encounters a man he doesn't know, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is literally in his face, telling him he has to take this job and that if he doesn't, the nation faces nuclear war.
He actually left the Oval Office in tears, you report.
Apparently, Warren is in tears, and Johnson takes a certain pride in that.
Warren seemed to think, as I read your book, that it was his job more to protect the Kennedy legacy in many ways than it was to get to the bottom of this. He seemed to just want to get it over with.
He clearly loved President Kennedy and the Kennedy family. And, he was as shocked as anybody about what had happened in Dallas. And repeatedly in the history of the Warren Commission, you see the Chief Justice making decisions that are designed to protect the privacy of the Kennedy family and the legacy of President Kennedy.
The result was that the autopsy photos were never seen by the investigators on the Warren Commission.
There was huge turmoil on the staff of the Warren Commission because Chief Justice Warren, he saw the awful, gruesome autopsy photos, and he made the decision that nobody would see them. None of the other commissioners, none of the staff, they would never be seen, even though they were the most important evidence, the medical evidence that was needed by the staff. And there's a big fight on the part of the staff to try to get the Chief Justice to change his mind.
Whatever happened to him?
They were retained by Robert Kennedy at the Justice Department, and Robert Kennedy was also very insistent that they not be released.
All right. We'll hear more from Phil Shenon in part 2 of Face the Nation. I'll be back in a moment with some personal thoughts about that day. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're going to continue our conversation with Phil Shenon. It is well known that Lee Harvey Oswald went to Mexico City in the weeks before the assassination. The Warren Commission concluded the trip didn't figure in the killing of President Kennedy. But this man thought otherwise. He is Winston Scott, seen here in a 1962 home movie taken in Mexico City, where he was the CIA station chief. Though he and others told the commission that the CIA had limited knowledge of Oswald's visit, he later wrote that he knew and suspected much more. When he died in 1971, a top CIA official flew to Mexico City and removed several boxes of documents from Scott's house. One of those documents, quietly declassified in the mid-1990s, was a section of Scott's unpublished memoirs, a section devoted to Oswald's trip to Mexico. Lee Harvey Oswald became a person of great interest to us, wrote Scott. Oswald's visits at both the Communist Cuban Embassy and the Soviet Embassy in Mexico City during his brief 5-day stay in September-October 1963 are, together with what is known of what took place during these visits, sufficient to make him a suspect agent acting on behalf of the Soviets in several things, possibly including the assassination of President Kennedy. So I have to ask you, Phil, is Winston Scott and what he wrote in this diary to be taken seriously? Was that conjecture on his part? Do we have any information that he might have had evidence to back that up?
Well, apparently, in his memoirs, he describes photographs, CIA photographs that were taken of Oswald in Mexico City, and he describes tapes of wiretap conversations in which Oswald was involved, and all of that disappeared. Certainly none of that material was ever provided to the Warren Commission.
Was he the one that came up with the story about that Oswald actually had some sort of a relationship with a woman, a Cuban woman in Mexico City? That was new to me when I read your book.
There is some evidence to suggest he had a brief relationship with a young Mexican woman who worked at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. The Warren Commission actually wanted to interview that woman, but Chief Justice Warren made the decision she would not be interviewed because he said she was a communist and we don't interview communists.
But this information was not passed on to the Warren Commission and was not passed on to the agents in Dallas in those days before President Kennedy came to Dallas.
Absolutely. And Win Scott told the Warren Commission that he did not believe there was a conspiracy. And apparently in his memoirs he says exactly the opposite.
So he deliberately, for whatever the reasons, didn't shoot straight with the Warren Commission.
I think that's very clear.
You know, there was another incident, one uncovered years later by Tom Johnson, who had worked for President Johnson in the White House, was his press secretary as he left the White House, and in the 1970s was the publisher of the Dallas Times-Herald and later then the head of CNN. We want to bring Tom in now. He's with us this morning. Tell us what you discovered, when was it, 1975, about some information that you came to know about.
Bob, it was 1975. I was sitting by an agent of the FBI that I had come to know over time. We were talking about the Warren Commission. We were talking about whether there had been any new information that had been discovered. He told me that Oswald had come to the Dallas office of the FBI, had left a threatening note several days before the assassination, and that note had been flushed, that is to say, had been destroyed.
How did that come about? What did you find out about how the note came to be destroyed? And do you know what was on the note?
I did not know precisely what was on the note. The work that I did with a great deal of cooperation, incidentally, from then FBI Director Clarence Kelly, showed that the note had been a threatening note, threatening to blow up the Dallas office of the FBI, the building, if the agents did not cease trying to interview Oswald's wife, Marina.
And we know, of course, that they had been in contact with both Marina and with Lee Harvey Oswald because he had defected to the Soviet Union, and she was, of course, a Russian national.
Yes, and the fact that she spoke no English at the time, and agents Hosty and Howe were showing up at the residence to try to interview her as a matter of some routine for those citizens of Russia who were living in the United States. But she was terribly frightened and thought perhaps that these men were even KGB.
And you were not about to publish something like this, though. You checked it out. So if I remember, you flew to Washington and met with the then head of the FBI, Clarence Kelly.
I had heard so many rumors over the years, so many conspiracy theories, and here I was as the publisher of the Dallas paper, that I felt this information had to be checked every possible way. So I asked for an emergency meeting with the then FBI Director Clarence Kelly. He and Assistant Director James Adams agreed to see me the following day. I flew to Washington and I described to them what I had learned. I also asked them to confirm it or deny it for me with one condition, that they would advise me of their findings and that we could then go forward with publication if it was true.
And they later told you it was.
And on a Saturday morning in September of 1975, Director Kelly called me to say that it was true. He was very saddened, I think, to learn of it, and we went forward with the publication.
And Phil, I'm going to get back to your book. As far as you know, this information never got to the Warren Commission.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the decision was made 2 days after the assassination to destroy this note. And in truth, we'll never know exactly what was in that note. And it's been described in different ways. But no, the Warren Commission knew absolutely nothing about it.
You know, one of the most fascinating parts of your book to me, because I've worked in Washington for more than 40 years now, and I know how hard it is to keep a secret around here. I mean, you can barely keep one through a 24-hour news cycle, but you reveal something, a secret that is held for 50 years, and that is that an investigator on the Warren Commission actually interviewed Fidel Castro. Never made a record of it, but tell us how that happened.
Well, this is a gentleman by the name of William Coleman, who was then a young lawyer from Philadelphia who's on the staff of the Warren Commission.
And who went on to become Secretary of Transportation in the Ford administration.
That's correct. And he's in charge of the conspiracy team on the Warren Commission. And he actually knows Fidel Castro from his days in jazz clubs in Harlem, and apparently during his visits to New York, Castro would visit. And Coleman is sent out on a boat to the waters off Cuba, very secretly, to meet with Fidel Castro to hear what Castro has to say, which is that he insists that he did not have any involvement in President Kennedy's assassination.
You know, Tom, Lyndon Johnson never accepted the Warren Commission report that there was no conspiracy. He told Joe Califano, one of his senior aides, others in the administration, the Kennedys were trying to get Castro, and Castro got him first. Did he ever have any evidence of that, or was that just a suspicion that he had?
To the best of my knowledge, President Johnson, former President Johnson, never had any hard evidence of that.
And Phil, did you ever find anything to indicate that Castro did indeed have this connection? We know when Oswald went to the Cuban embassy in Mexico, right, he tried to get a visa to go to Cuba, but the Cubans wouldn't give him one. My sense was that they turned him away. They didn't want to deal with him.
That's apparently correct, or at least that is the story we were told at the time. But, you know, in Mexico City, Oswald is dealing with Cuban spies and Soviet spies and Mexicans sympathetic to Castro who might have had reason to want to see the end of John Kennedy's presidency. And all of those connections went really uninvestigated by the FBI and the CIA. They didn't want to find out what the truth was down there.
Tom, you interviewed Castro yourself many years after that when you were with the LA Times or the...
I was then with CNN.
With CNN,
yes,
by that time.
Yes.
Did you ever get any sense that there was a Castro connection here?
President Castro said to me and my international editor, Eason Jordan, and our deputy international editor, Larry Register, that under no conditions did anybody in his government have any connection with the assassination. And I'll never forget his quote as translated to me. He said, if there ever were any evidence, they would have incinerated my little island.
Phil, in your book, you talk about, and there's no question about this. I mean, there's been reports about it since. There's no question that the administration before that was trying to sabotage Castro in every way they could. They were trying to topple him. The Bay of Pigs had been, a complete failure. But right up until the assassination, the CIA was still trying to carry out some sort of a move to assassinate Castro.
They were trying to kill him. And on the day of President Kennedy's assassination, a CIA officer in Paris is handing a poison pen to a man who's apparently assigned to kill Castro. No, the Kennedy administration was very clearly trying to oust Castro, and almost certainly violently.
And, from time to time came up with these various plots, bring in the mafia to see if they could help and that sort of thing. Castro had to know about that.
He did know about it. In fact, just weeks before the assassination, Castro gave an interview in Havana in which he said he was aware that the Kennedy administration was trying to kill him, and there would be retaliation if that continued.
But apparently, as Tom Johnson came away from it believing, he thought that the consequences would be disastrous for Cuba if he did try something. I mean, we'll never know. Obviously, he's going to deny it, but we'll never know any more than that. We'll be back in 1 minute. We're going to bring... There are not many of us left who covered the assassination of John Kennedy, but only those of us who were alive before that awful weekend can really know how much it changed America. We had been a confident nation. We had won World War II. We believed in our leaders. We came to see our presidents as all but invincible. Because of television, we had come to know John Kennedy and his family more intimately than any of his predecessors. Then, in a matter of seconds, he was killed by a madman. As the entire nation watched in horror and shock as the events of the weekend unfolded on television in real time, the first time that had ever happened, our national confidence was shaken to the core. That weekend began one of the most violent decades in our country's history. More assassinations, Vietnam, the beginnings of Watergate. A time that Americans came to question almost everything we had once taken for granted. As it always had, the nation rebounded from those dark days, but it was never quite the same. It was the weekend America lost its innocence. Back in a minute.